Dr James Morton, my special guest in the studio. Let's talk about Andy and his autism, because you did discover that Andy, at a young age, was autistic. What was that like for you, being a medical professional as well as a father? That must have been...
Oh, it was... look, you don't forget that day. And it's not like you get diagnosed one day. Andy had been... I think the most perfect baby up until one, and then the wheels fell off after he turned one.
Did you suspect something from a medical point of view?
No, it's the mothers who know. It was Louise who was really worried about him. Andy never spoke. He got increasingly anxious and agitated and would throw on big hissy fits all the time. We virtually couldn't go anywhere socially because he'd just lose the plot. He'd want to watch the same video over again, all of the classic things that you see with a child with autism. We had his hearing tested. He had grommets in. Was he deaf? Went through this process. Around his second birthday, the paediatrician said, okay, well, things aren't developing as they should. We now need to go through a bunch of tests. And he had a MRI and gene studies and EEGs and that sort of stuff. And when we went to get the results, he said, look, he's autistic. And I remember walking back from the terrace with Louise at that time, and she was in tears, and I knew nothing about autism. I mean, when I was a medical student, I did very well in my paediatric rotation, but autism was a paragraph in the textbook back then. So it wasn't something I knew anything about. And
I don't think it's something a lot of people
know it certainly is getting a lot more attention now, and awareness is improving.
A lot in the last couple of years.
It's you sort of... The thing about getting it as a diagnosis is no one can tell you what will happen in the future. You want to know what's going to happen to my child. Now, if a child's diagnosed with leukemia, I can say you'll have this and this treatment, and these are the statistics, and if that doesn't work, we'll do this, and it's a finite period. When your child's diagnosed with autism, it's this complete uncertainty. And back then in 2002, there were no services either. And
why weren't there services?
I think
because I'm sure there would have been a lot of parents in the same boat as you.
I think autism is a problem that has exploded, and there may be various reasons for that, but I think the community, in terms of the services that these little children require, was caught very unaware. And certainly that was the thing we faced. Like everyone, you do your Google search, you start to read. And in fact, my brother has an economics consulting firm, and he got his staff to do this fantastic literature review for everything about autism for me, and I went and read that, and we realised that what Andy needed was really a very intensive program, and they just didn't exist. And you've just, everywhere you went, you faced long waiting lists. You could do home-based programs, but...
God, how frustrating.
Yeah, and the home-based program, we were interviewed with the home-based providers, and we were really disappointed with what they had to suggest and offer. And at that time, Disability Services would offer a playgroup, which was like an hour a week. And all the research showed these children need 20 hours a week of intensive programming, very high staff-to-child ratio, very specialised staff. But that if you did that, you could change the pathway that they would otherwise face. And Louise eventually found a pilot program being run at Junction Park State School at Annerley, and it had a teacher and two teacher aides and a small group of children. And we went and hassled our local Member of Parliament, who was able then to get Andy a spot. And that's one of the very important things, that when you've got a child with any disability, the parents, the squeaky wheel gets oiled, and you have to be a very strong advocate for your child, because you will always face barriers. And he got into that program. And
how old was he at this stage?
He was about 2.5, 3.
And how severe was he on the spectrum?
Andy's pretty severe. He's a very average child with autistic disorder, and the listeners need to understand that autism is a spectrum, and we may talk later about Asperger's syndrome, which is the very high-functioning children who look and speak and talk and all that sort of thing normally, but have a number of social challenges.
Yep.
Through to the severely autistic children, which is The Black Balloon, the film that was made by an Australian girl about her brother. And that's the very severe end, and Andy's kind of halfway in between. So he's really a classic autistic boy. He still has very limited language and communication, and he still gets fixated by things, but he's dramatically improved over the years.
It does affect boys more than girls, doesn't it?
Yeah, the ratio's 4-1.
Why is that? Do we know?
Look, there are some fascinating theories about it. There's a brilliant guy in the UK called Simon Baron-Cohen. Now, very interesting last name. He's actually Sacha Baron Cohen's cousin.
Okay.
Borat has a cousin who is the world's leading expert on autism. And he's really looked at this issue of boys and girls, and he wrote a book a few years ago which was about the male and female minds, and he looked at boys who have a very categorical way of thinking, the engineers into categories, very systematic thinking, he called it, and girls who are more empathetic. And he postulated that autism was the extreme form of the male mind. And he's gone back and looked at...
Gee, that's an interesting theory, isn't it?
It gets better. He went back, and when people were having amniocentesis, where they get placental fluid off to analyse for other things, he went, and for people having amniocentesis for other reasons, went and got the samples and measured the testosterone levels in the placental fluid. He then looked at the children 5 years later, both the boys and girls. These were non-autistic children, but looked at their thought processes. And he was able to correlate high in utero testosterone levels with the male thought patterns. So testosterone levels influence the way the brain develops and the way the brain thinks in utero. And so autism, his postulate is that it is this extreme form of the very categorical, systematic thought processes, at least Asperger's syndrome is, but without the empathy and the social understanding and social awareness, and that's the way the brain develops. And then autism has additional features thrown in on top of that. Anyway, that's the theory, one theory why it's more common in boys.
This is fascinating, and I hated science at school, but listening to Dr James Morton, I'm finding this, I think I should have paid more attention. You're listening to Summer Weekends with me, Alex Bernard, on Brisbane's own 1116 4BC. My special guest this afternoon, founder of the AEIOU foundation, I should say, Dr James Morton. We'll talk some more with James in just a moment.
Alex Bernard, Summer Weekends on Brisbane's own 1116 4BC.
Dr James Morton in the studio with me, and we're talking about autism because Andrew, James and Louise's second child, was diagnosed when he was little, and this really set you on a path, James, to start the foundation.
What happened with the program Andy got into was we immediately saw improvement. So, for example, Andy had no language at the time, and what they taught Andy... How frustrating
was that for you and Louise?
It was. There is nothing harder than raising a young child with autistic disorder. It is just so tough on a family.
Do you know, I thought of you the other day, James, because there's this television program called Parenthood. And one of the major storylines is this family, they've got a teenage daughter and a younger son, Max, and he's autistic. And one of the major storylines in the show is how the family unit and particularly the parents are coping with it. And sometimes it's really hard to watch that. I want to cry for the mother.
The little child who throws the enormous screaming fit in the shopping centre, that everyone goes around and says, oh, what bad parenting, and they just need to smack. Some of those kids have got autism and they can't help it. And as a parent raising these children, and I've looked at that show, and that boy's got Asperger's syndrome, so he's at that different end of the spectrum. But a little child with autism who is who has no language, who can't communicate, who's very socially anxious, and who just wants to do the same thing over and over again in a very tightly controlled world. You can imagine how for a family it just leads to everything about not having this child throw on a turn. Brothers and sisters miss out. One parent can't work. It's incredibly difficult and challenging to raise these children.
I hope this isn't too personal a question, but I just wonder how you don't lose yourself in all of that.
I'm lucky in that I have an amazing wife who I've been able to follow a medical career and do all these other things because she does such a brilliant job with Andy and with our other two children. But the rates of depression are very high in parents of these children.
And I would imagine the relationship breakdown would be very high.
Marital separation is very common too because it just gets very, very hard.
So much pressure.
We're doing some really interesting research with the AEIOU Foundation at the moment around family functioning, and one of the interesting observations that we're seeing is, in fact, the very high degree to which fathers struggle and face high rates of depression. And I think it's because fathers are meant to kind of be strong and go to work, and the mothers get together with other mothers and talk it through, and the fathers don't. And it's a line of research we're following at the moment, but it's actually a very important observation, and it does lead to very high rates of marital breakdown.
Yeah, and this is another great thing about what AEIOU Foundation does and is doing is, unfortunately, as you said, the pilot program that you and Louise first got Andy involved in was closed, and there just weren't the facilities to help people in the same situation as you and help kids like Andy. No. So this is what the foundation is actually doing, and it's a very intense one-on-one, you've got amazing specialists, and I don't think there's anything else like this.
No, it's quite
anywhere.
unique. What our I talk as a businessman a bit here. We had a unique business idea, which was to create a new variety of childcare, which was specialised childcare. And so we set up childcare centres just for autistic children. And what it effectively did, there were several things it did. Firstly, it meant that the parents got respite, because for 6 to 8 hours a day, that child goes to this program. The second thing it did was it was not like any other childcare centre. So our childcare centres have one staff member for every 2 children. Every childcare centre has a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, an early childhood teacher. And we have this, our staff have created this amazing curriculum where everything the child does, and it's play-based, but it's a learning experience. So they use every opportunity there to develop the skill set of these little kids with autism.
James, did you rob a bank? Did you win lotto?
Yeah.
How? Because they are all highly specialised people. And when you talk about, 2 children per specialist for whatever, that must cost a fortune to run something like this.
What we did, when we got the idea to do this, we went and bought a church at Maruka, and we converted it into a childcare centre and hired 6 staff. And the program, because of its staff to child ratio, is very expensive. It's a little over $40,000 a year. And one of our tenets had been that we didn't want families to face any greater costs than they would for accessing normal childcare. So using our experiences with the Leukemia Foundation and the Shave, we did a lot of fundraising to fill in that gap. The state minister at that time was a wonderful fellow called Warren Pitt. And amazingly now his son is the new disability minister. So I'm looking very forward to meeting his son. But Warren came and opened our centre, and I think he saw what we did. And Warren was a former teacher, and he was a huge believer in early intervention for children and young adults. He did a lot of work around children who were ending up in prison in terms of trying to get them out of different pathways. So he put state money up. Now, we've had very high benchmarks to get to, but it was really what he did, and subsequently Anastasia Palaszczuk did, that's allowed quite a unique thing to happen in Queensland, where we now have a network of these centres, and there's nothing like it anywhere else in the world. And all up the Queensland coast are now early intervention centres for autistic children, and we're now moving into the region. So there are centres. Are you
going to expand down south to New South Wales and Victoria?
They've got to want us to come. They're starting to copy our idea rather than actually invite us to do so, but that's okay. So we've got the centres in Toowoomba and Townsville, and Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast, and Townsville. There's new centres to be opened in Mackay and Bundaberg shortly. And we've done this super cool project with Good Start, the old ABC. We're now in regional areas, and we've piloted in Emerald. Young autistic children in those towns will attend the ABC Centre, but we'll deliver an autism program within that framework. And this is something we're just starting to model, but it's working very well. And that becomes a way where you can get to children now wherever they live, whereas previously it was such a barrier if you didn't live in a major city. Yeah,
James, how many, as you're talking about expanding into the regional parts of Queensland, I'm thinking, how many autistic children are there in Australia?
Well, in our program in Queensland, we currently have 177 children enrolled. We have waiting lists of about 50 children. And another organisation, AEIOU, also provides services in Cairns and Rockhampton. The probable need in Queensland is about 300 placements. There's probably about 150 children a year diagnosed in Queensland with autistic disorder. Now, again, I come back to that very specific term. Our program is about children with autistic disorder, or another variant called pervasive developmental disorder. The whole spectrum includes children with Asperger's syndrome as well. Overall, the spectrum, the diagnostic rate's now 1 in 100 children, but only a proportion of those have autistic disorder, and as such would go to our program. And probably about 1 in 300 children have a disability that benefits from our program, that is the autistic disorder children like my son Andy, or the kids with this condition called PDD-NOS.